Hello, everybody. This is Rob Fredette with the podcast Hodgepod. I have a return guest on my podcast. He was on here last year, in June of last year, and his name is Clayton Trutor. He's the author of Bostonball, Rick Pitino, Jim Calhoun, Gary Williams, and the Forgotten Cradle of Basketball Coaches. I read the book, and I love the book because I grew up in the Boston area playing high school basketball, but I was also in the minority because I loved college basketball, and of course the Celtics were the hot commodity back then in the early 80s. And Clayton, welcome back to my podcast. I can't wait to talk about this again. This is tremendous. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me on. You, I think, were the first or second show I did to talk about the book. So it was a very memorable experience. And
well, good.
The more opportunities you get is fantastic. You get in front of more people, and you also get just more practice talking about it in front of people. I remember our previous meeting. It was great.
Well, thank you. And I've listened to your other podcasts that you've done and other shows that you've done with some heavy hitters in the Boston area as well. So I always like that. But one thing about this book that I really enjoyed was I knew things about Boston, the coaches, Gary Williams, Pitino, and Calhoun, but on the periphery. But the way you detailed some of the items in the book, it was like I felt like I was in the locker room with some of these incidents on the court during practice. And that was really I had to soak it in, and that was tremendous.
Thank you so much. As a guy who was a very marginal athlete himself, the idea that you felt like I brought you into the locker room is a tremendous feeling. And that's really thanks to all the guys I was able to interview for the book. I wrote this book during the height of the pandemic, and a lot of people were sitting at home, and I cranked out roughly 100 interviews. I think it was 96 total in basically a 3-month period, including Williams, including Calhoun, including many of their players, journalists, other coaches, student managers were great to talk to. I talked to like 3 or 4 from each student, and they had all the inside stuff. So it was great being able to talk to all those people. And if that's a strength of the book, it's thanks to them entirely.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you brought back stuff from the Boston Globe. Michael Madden, Jackie McMullen, Leslie Visser, they were columnists and reporters, beat writers for the Boston Globe at the time. So I kind of felt like I was back there, because that was like the media back then. You read the Boston Herald, read the Boston Globe, and that's where you got your sports information. So I love the nostalgic part of it as well. You did a lot of digging on that, didn't you?
Absolutely. I mean, McMullen and Visser really got their start covering college basketball. I mean, the 4 pro sports were definitely first in terms of coverage in Boston. Even the Patriots, when they were not certainly the Patriots of the 21st century, got a lot more coverage than college basketball in Boston did. In essence, they were doing due diligence by covering those teams, and they sent the young reporters. And McMullen and Visser both did a fantastic job covering those teams, and a lot of the details I have in the book are the result of their reporting. And Michael Madden, among the editorialists for the Globe then, was probably the strongest promoter of college basketball in the city. He is the guy who coins the term. Bostonball comes from one of his columns referring to what was happening in the city with this renaissance of the game and all of the teams playing in somewhat similar fashions. I mean, one aspect of the book is that there's an innovation in college basketball in the late 70s and early 80s by all these coaches bringing in a pressing, trapping, aggressive style of basketball in an era that was largely dominated by big men. So these schools weren't able to go out and recruit Bill Walton or Artis Gilmore or Bob Lanier or anything. So they had to get smaller guys and play a game that worked around the skill sets they had. So I think that's an important part of the story too.
Yeah, and when you speak, we'll start off with Rick Pitino. Rick Pitino, of course, started at Boston University, and one of the things that I found extraordinary, he was actually passing out pamphlets for people, the students, to come to games back at BU, because they were getting probably, 300 people at the Case Gym?
Oh, yeah, 300 was a good crowd sometimes for them. I mean, it was sort of like being in a garage, even though he was a Division I basketball coach, had recruited fine Division I athletes to come play there. They were like guys in a garage band. Anybody familiar with BU on Comm Ave, Decker Towers is the big student dormitories there at BU. The players were going around knocking on doors at Decker Towers saying, "Can you come watch my game?" There weren't a lot of other big-time college basketball players doing that. But that's part of the culture of Boston, I would say, certainly. It's a very unconventional college town. I mean, it's sometimes called America's college town, but it's not one in the sense of Ann Arbor, Michigan, or Madison, Wisconsin, or Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where the primary form of entertainment in town is college sports. I mean, there's so many, the competing interests of a big city, the aspect of all the different pro sports available. Mm-hmm. So BU basketball was right at the bottom of the list in terms of entertainments. Even on their own campus, they were radically overshadowed by their hockey team, which under Jack Parker had won several national titles in the 70s and early 80s. You have Mike Eruzione and Jim Craig, who are probably the two most significant figures on the Miracle on Ice team playing at BU in that time period. I mean, these guys all knew Eruzione and Craig and stuff. So that was who was getting the attention on campus, not the fantastic athletes who played for BU, the likes of Tony Sims and Arturo Brown, Gary Plummer, guys who played in the NBA or certainly in our current era would. I mean, getting to the NBA was a much harder thing in 1983 than it is now when you have 30 teams now as opposed to the 20-team league at that point. I mean, Plummer ended up playing for the Pistons a little bit, but the other guys certainly, if circumstances had been a little different, would have as well.
Yeah, and Plummer was a tremendous basketball player. And one thing about Boston University is when Pitino was there, he was relentless in his practices, and he really pushed the Terriers in an extraordinary fashion because he had a brick drill, if I'm not mistaken, and he had him running and running and running for conditioning. And he was, at the time, they probably didn't like it, but the players now, when you were talking to them, revere him, they love him.
Yeah, I mean, the brick drill, these guys, if they screw up in practice, they're going from sideline to sideline with literal bricks taped to their hands in a defensive position up and doing this over and over again. And it was rather unpleasant and largely avoided. I've read that he uses the same drills to this day at St. John's, this brick drill. And wow. Billy Donovan, who's one of his disciples, incorporated that into his own coaching, too. So I think it's become an infamous thing in gyms across North America.
The thing about Pitino is he's relentless, but he was also a marketer as well. You can see he's so polished. I mean, he was polished back then, but he's polished now. He's a tremendous basketball coach, but back then he had to sell the BU program. I mean, he was saying that we're going to be the most intense basketball team. We're going to come at you for full 40 minutes. He lived up to that his time at BU.
Absolutely. I mean, he came in with all the braggadocio that he still has. Yeah. I mean, everybody who saw him said, this is a really cocky 25-year-old that people wanted to knock off his pedestal, that he was on well before he had really earned it. But he lived up to everything he said. And I think in some ways that confidence, I think in many ways that confidence served him well and served his team well because it trickled down to his team as well. They were incredibly well prepared, incredibly conditioned. The BU basketball teams before Pitino kind of walked the ball up the floor and had a very mechanistic off. And then they're very much in the kind of Nolan Richardson 40 minutes of hell mentality. And teams that had played them the previous year and whipped them, they're like, what happened in the off season? Suddenly you guys are supermen and have turned this game into a track meet. So Pitino, long before people talked about we're changing the culture around here, Pitino certainly did that at Boston University.
You know, in 1994, my brother was working at the Pyramid here in Memphis, and I volunteered to work the SEC tournament. It was something, I look back at it now, I'm so glad I did. I was a gopher. I just did everything. I wanted to be in the moment. I was able to see some of the practices when they were going on. I saw Arkansas with Nolan Richardson, and I saw Kentucky. And Kentucky, his practices, the Kentucky practice that I saw, very, very disciplined and very, very structured. I remember that Billy Donovan and he were running that practice like clockwork.
And then you have Travis Ford playing point guard then, who becomes another one of those guys. Yeah. I mean, he's very much in that Pitino mold, too. He would find these guys back to his time at BU who became his coach on the floor, and Ford would certainly have been in that sensibility as well.
Northeastern is having lived in the Boston area, Northeastern is like the main rival, I would say, of Boston University, especially in hockey, but in basketball as well. And Jim Calhoun, he started a little bit earlier than Pitino in the early 70s, and he had to really, it took him a while to get that program, to national prominence because early 80s he got Perry Moss and a few other players, but it took him some time, but once he got that ball rolling at Northeastern, he had that stretch there when Reggie Lewis was there.
Well, he sort of got to be the head coach by accident. In 1972, Northeastern has 3 coaches. I mean, their first coach is this guy, Dick Dukeshire, who no less than an authority than Mike Jarvis referred to as the best college coach in the history of New England. Dukeshire had been a great Division II coach at Northeastern, taken a program that had never really had a lot of success, got a bunch of non-scholarship guys, and made them one of the D2 powers in the country. They played really tough defense. They got a lot of these really tough kids from the towns around Boston, and we're able to play with the best D2 teams in the country, many of which are D1 programs now. So taking relatively little talent, Dukeshire won year after year after year at Northeastern. Then he ran into the guy who ran the Greek national basketball program, who asked him to be their coach. He went to the Olympics. He got sick and couldn't coach. So then they ended up having an interim coach named Jim Bowman for a season. Bowman ends up leaving because he gets offered a gig with the FBI. He always wanted to be an officer. September 1972, the letter comes to him saying, you can now come to the FBI Academy. Bowman ends up taking that over coaching a second season at Northeastern. So a couple of weeks before the season starts, the very season in which Northeastern is transferring from what was called the college division to the university division, which is D2 to D1, they need a coach with a team full of basically Division II basketball players. And Calhoun takes over a couple weeks before the season starts. In many ways, keeps in place what's going there, while maybe allowing them to be a little more aggressive offensively. Some of the guys, there's a guy named Mark Jellison, who had been a fairly ordinary player under Dukeshire, who suddenly turned into Larry Bird and is scoring 25 or 28 points a game for them in the 72-73 season. He lets a couple of these guys just let it rip, and they went 19-7 playing a Division I schedule largely. I mean, they had a couple of early games against the likes of Tufts and St. Anselm's and stuff, which are the schools they would have played normally. But they're playing big-time schools up and down the East Coast and playing very competitively. It took Calhoun a while to get things going. Once he was trying to recruit his own players who weren't part of that Dukeshire system, they were kind of a 500 team for much of the 1970s. But as you said, once they developed these pipelines, a pipeline into Pittsburgh, a pipeline into the Baltimore area, they're getting guys like Perry Moss and Mark Halsell and finally Reggie Lewis and Andre LaFleur, who end up becoming the guys who transform Northeastern into the first true mid-major program in my mind. Because just as the tournament is expanding from a 25-team field all the way to 64, Northeastern is the Gonzaga of the era. They're the team you don't want to play in the early rounds. For 3 consecutive years, they scored first-round upsets. I mean, people would laugh about them saying, "Oh, are you Northwestern? What's your name? Who are you?" But after they played them, certainly nobody wanted to play these Northeastern teams of Jim Calhoun again. And very much he cultivated a chip on the shoulder of these guys that I think he brought with him to UConn. This mentality, you're going to UConn because Syracuse and Villanova and Georgetown didn't recruit you. Let's prove them wrong. So he brought that sensibility with him from his 14 years at Northeastern, which it certainly took a while for his program to evolve into the power it became.
You know, the people who called Northeastern Northwestern should have been fired on the television. They should have been let go of any duties they had to disrespect Northeastern. Were they also called Northwestern State?
Yes, they were called Northwestern State, which is the only thing I know about Northwestern State in Louisiana is it's the place where Jim Croce performed his last concert before he got in a plane and died. That's the only thing I've ever heard about that place. They were called Northeastern, which I feel like, were they making fun of Calhoun's accent by putting that in I mean, that's an actual town. I mean, I believe it's the town where Jim Craig is from. But that was on their locker room one time. I mean, I taught for a time at Northeastern, and once when I went to a conference, they had written Northeastern on it like that as well. And I thought to myself, are they making fun of the way people in Boston talk by putting that? It was like a conference in I think it was in San Antonio. And I was walking around with I was working at Northeastern, little, what do you call it, things that hang from your
the lanyards.
Neck when you're when you're at a conference. Yeah.
That really irked me. I'm sorry. If you're a television anchor or if you're a television broadcaster, you need to get it right the first time. That's a cardinal sin in broadcasting, as far as I'm concerned. They should have been fired.
The lack of respect they had. The guys from Oklahoma, their coach Billy Tubbs, I think we played them a couple of years ago, and he's referring to Northwestern Louisiana, or that they played before. Yeah, it was a very different era, because I think now the big time schools don't treat the early round opponents with that kind of disrespect, because it's come back to bite them many times in this age when a team of good veteran players who played together oftentimes find a way to beat these teams of great players who are just coming together for one season.
Yeah, and the teams today, they don't like playing those small teams, the mid-major teams, because if they get upset, that doesn't look good for them either. So it's quite extraordinary.
Absolutely. I mean, I think back to, of course, Virginia and UMBC is the one that really stands out in my mind, because that team, of course, goes on to win the national title the next years. next year. Who knows what would have happened if they got by UMBC? Virginia's such a funny team in the tournament, but that's a whole other conversation.
One other thing I loved about it, and I didn't really know about it, is the fact that the players from the local colleges were playing against the Celtics at the Roberts Center. The likes of Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, Bill Walton, Danny Ainge, DJ played against the likes of Reggie Lewis and other players from BC and BU. For me, I would have been fanboy. I would have been like, oh my God, I can't believe that Bird and McHale are playing in the pickup game with me. But that is extraordinary. I think that may have helped those teams in the regular season, the following season.
Absolutely. One of my favorite guys I interviewed for the book was a guy named Stu Primus, who had a lot of injuries in his career, but was a very effective sixth man on the BC 1985 team that got to the Sweet 16. And he told me it was unbelievable the confidence that gave them going into the NCAA tournament. They'd, of course, played the big boys from the Big East in the regular season, but, they'd been playing against Kevin McHale and Cedric Maxwell and Bill Walton. Texas Tech is not going to scare them. So they came in thinking they could beat anybody in these tournament games.
That's tremendous. Can you imagine playing in a pickup game with McHale or Bird being on their team? And I'm sure the guys from the Celtics loved it because they just wanted to go in and play ball, and I'm sure they had a camaraderie there as well. Did you get that sense? Maybe there was a camaraderie between the Celtics and the college players?
Absolutely, yes. Several of the guys became friends with the players. A bunch of them became friends with Ainge in particular because he was more their age. Ainge had just got out of college, was roughly the same age as these guys. Parrish brought a couple of these guys to a game one time. I remember Troy Bowers, one of the players, telling me about. There ended up being strong connections among these guys, and a bunch of them ended up in the NBA too, being part of that fraternity. So that ended up being a long-standing relationship for many of these guys. Chris Ford goes from playing on the Celtics, he's on the 81 title team, to being a BC assistant for a time before continuing his career. So he certainly is an important piece of connective tissue, having played for the Celtics and then being a Boston College assistant for a time.
Yeah, and then Reggie Lewis, of course, he played for the Celtics, got drafted by the Celtics. He was in those pickup games as well. So maybe they gave some intel on the Jan Volk and the management of the Celtics to draft him. I think when we spoke last year, I think he was like the hidden jewel in Boston, Reggie Lewis, when the Celtics got him. That was a tremendous pick for the Celtics.
Yeah, they couldn't believe that he felt that he was picked. I think it was 21 or 23 or something. They couldn't believe he fell that far. That this is a lottery talent without question. And it was a genuine prize for the Celtics, and somebody, as you said, they'd seen for several years. The elite players from BU and Northeastern would both come up regularly to Roberts Center and play in those September games. And the BU and Northeastern guys would frequently play pickup against each other in like courts over in the Fenway neighborhood and stuff like that, kind of like a middle ground before them. So that was an aspect of their time in Boston too. These guys all knew each other so well on and off the court.
Mm-hmm. And another thing about Pitino, Jim Calhoun rivalry, I know they used to run by each other along the Charles River and probably not acknowledge each other. This year in the Big East tournament, I did see something, and I think you may have seen it as well. Jim Calhoun was a guest on the show after the games where they do interviews, and Rick Pitino showed up for an interview, and they asked Rick Pitino a question. John Fanta, he asked him a question, and Rick Pitino, he goes, he started off, I want to just say he gave Jim Calhoun all the respect that he had, and he had not spoken in 20 years. If that's correct, that just blew me away. My jaw just dropped.
Well, they had certainly had a contentious relationship in Boston, but the minute it was over, you could tell that they both missed it from their quotes in the press, that it had made them both better having that competition in the city. BU dropped off for a couple of years after Pitino leaves, and Calhoun, within a year, is like, this is just so different than it was when Pitino was here. We had a war with them, same group of guys, different coaching situation. But yeah, that mutual respect goes back decades, despite their animosities and the conflict that often happened between those teams on the floor. There were more than a few scraps between BU and Northeastern teams in this time period. In fact, the first ever game that Calhoun coached was a game against BU, and there was a brawl after the game. It was a handshake line punch kind of thing that everything just went haywire in the game. So from the time he got there, that was certainly a part of Calhoun's experience at Northeastern. And I'm not surprised by the mutual sense of respect for their accomplishments these guys have, even though they certainly weren't on the friendliest terms forever.
Yeah, I think they actually liked seeing each other that day. That you could just tell the warmth they had towards each other. I thought it was tremendous. And when he had talked about the Charles River, I thought of you right away because he had mentioned the Charles River, and it's in the book here. So
yeah, there's so few people that have those shared experiences that even if they had animosity at one point, not many people can relate to what they both saw, just the transformation of college basketball from being this relatively minor thing in a lot of places to the age of March Madness, of it being this multi-billion-dollar industry. They're certainly two of the faces of the transformation of the college game, and they were there when it was something very different, part of a very small world and a small fraternity.
Yeah, a very small fraternity. Their records are absolutely tremendous in the coaching ranks. I mean, they're among the all-time greats as far as wins. Getting ready for this, I just wanted to go to see who the top coaches are in the all-time NCAA men's basketball. So Coach K has 1,202 wins. Jim Boeheim, 1,015. Bobby Huggins, which I was surprised, 935. Jim Calhoun's number at 920 wins. Roy Williams, Bobby Knight, Dean Smith, Adolph Rupp, Cliff Ellis, 828. And then Pitino was ranked at the time when I looked at a couple weeks ago, number 35 with 711, and Gary Williams 668. So they're in the top 50. So a lot of that is that foundation in Boston.
Absolutely, yeah. It certainly gets it rolling for all these guys. I've said on a couple of podcasts, and I believe it, I think Calhoun is the second greatest college coach of all time behind John Wooden. I mean, I think Wooden's kind of in a world his own with all those championships in such a short period of time. But Calhoun was able to take a program that had been pretty good in New England, but no way of power, and making them this kind of unending dynasty, it seems like to me, with his 3 championships there. I mean, they also, I think there's not a more successful coach in March in some respects than Calhoun. If he has a team that's capable of getting to the Final Four, they find a way to win that. I guess he'd had one trip before he ends up winning a championship, but relative to the amount of times that they got in a position to win a championship, they really find a way to do it. And I mean, they certainly have over the years. I mean, if you look at, say, Coach K by comparison, Duke under Norm Sloan had been in the Final Four like 2 or 3 years before he got there. Bobby Knight, Indiana, had a long, strong history before that. Dean Smith, UNC, had been a very strong program with McGuire before he got there. Calhoun is walking into kind of a rough situation. They're one of the bottom feeders of the Big East, and he turns them into a team that's in the national conversation every season.
And I remember reading the book, Coach K brought an Army team. I think they played Boston University. Coach K came to Boston, and it's amazing when you see, like, when they were young coaches, it's amazing. Like, would have thought Coach K would be coming. I mean, you think of him as Duke, but he was at Army before that. That's amazing as well. Certainly these teams played Army a lot, was a fixture on their schedules over the years. I mean, both Calhoun and Pitino coached against Army on several occasions in their young career and faced off with Krzyzewski teams too. And they were always a battle, those games, even though probably in most instances Northeastern and BU would have had more talent than those Army teams. I mean, Coach K had a way of getting those teams prepared to play and being very successful, and was able to jump up pretty quickly from Army to having a big-time job like Duke. Yeah, it was 1979, 1980. They played Northeastern, and Northeastern beat Army 61-57. So it was 1979-80 season. So Boston College is the third team, or the third coach, Gary Williams. I'm a University of Maryland graduate, so I remember when he took over Maryland and resurrected that from the tragic Len Bias death, and then the athletic department purge, I guess you could say. Gary Williams really made some noise with Boston College as well, and he obviously had some great players with Kevin Mackey, who was recruiting, but he was really not a carbon copy, but again, a relentless, intense coach.
Absolutely, and he gets his way up by, in some ways, following along with Tom Davis, who'd been his mentor all the way back at Maryland. He'd been the starting point guard, and Tom Davis had been an assistant coach while pursuing his history. They hook back up at Lafayette, where Tom Davis is the head coach. Gary Williams becomes an assistant there and also has to coach the soccer team. He had never kicked a soccer ball before he was a Division I soccer coach as part of the deal. He coaches soccer for 5 seasons. I think the record was like 27, 37, and 1, which is not bad if you've never even played the sport, I would say. But Lafayette became the surprising power of the East Coast Conference of the time period, beating Temple and Drexel and a lot of schools that had a lot more resources than they did in terms of St. Joseph's in terms of basketball. That gets Tom Davis the BC job. Gary Williams follows him there. Williams goes off and has his own gig coaching at American, coaching in a National Guard Armory, getting the American University team, which is hardly a historic basketball power, to the NIT. When the BC job opens up, and Tom, in the aftermath of the point-shaving scandal, I think Davis just wanted to get away from all of that. Davis had nothing to do with it. Williams had nothing to do with it. It was really three players that had any connection to it whatsoever. Nobody knew until Henry Hill, blabs to Sports Illustrated a couple years after that in 1981. Williams takes over and keeps things going at BC. BC had been one of the, I guess you'd say, almost like surprise powers of the early Big East. Tom Davis got the ball rolling with an up-tempo offense, pressure defense. Williams just turned it up even more so. I mean, his team ran for 40 minutes like Pitino's did, and they conditioned a lot of future NBA guys who had significant careers. John Bagley, Michael Adams come out of there. John Garris played in the league for a bit. You have a fair number of guys. What's his name? Jay Murphy comes out of there. All these guys who were big-time players in the Big East end up having NBA careers out of that BC team. And every year they're picked 5th, 6th in the Big East. They don't have the size to compete. They don't have the talent to compete. They would go out and win. They won the Big East regular season title twice under Gary Williams. They got to the Sweet 16 twice, went to the tournament 3 times in 4 years. I mean, these were some excellent teams he coached, and they were playing against the very best teams in the country. In the year that the Big East had 3 Final Four teams in 1985, BC was near the 4th one. They got beat on really just an errant pass in their Sweet 16 game against Memphis, who goes on to the Final Four. Memphis in the Elite Eight crushed Oklahoma. So BC likely would have been able to overcome them as well and be the 4th Final Four team. He had, in fact, played all 4 of the teams in the Final Four, defeated 2 of them, and lost by 1 point to the other 2, Georgetown and Memphis. So they were certainly capable of competing with all of those teams in the Final Four that year.
That's tremendous. And I remember when they had quite a few games at the Boston Garden against Georgetown and the likes of St. John's and the other powers. But I remember the Georgetown games were absolutely wars, and it was must-see TV back then. I remember if I'm not mistaken, it was Channel 38 those games used to be on, and it was quite fun to watch. And those guys for BC, Northeastern, they were like rock stars to me because even though the Celtics were in their heyday, I really enjoyed watching those college teams. It was a lot of fun. I was one of those junkies. I had to watch everything. A lot of people like pro sports up there. I was like the college and the pro guy.
Yeah, I've always had that mentality too. When I was a kid, I watched sports with my mom mostly. My mom loves college sports, probably more than pro sports. So I always watched a lot of college basketball with my mom. Watched tons of college football. I mean, I actually dedicated the book to my mom because of just how much she introduced college basketball to me and made this a passion of mine. Yeah, I had a very similar experience to you in terms of putting the college game at least alongside pro sports.
And also BC, I know they played at the Roberts Center, but he had Dr. Tom Davis and then Gary Williams. That success they had in the early '80s and even into when Jim O'Brien, that helped build the Conte Forum, did it not?
Absolutely, yeah. That would not have gotten built without that. I mean, there's certainly the Flutie effect going on too. That just brings everything at BC up in a more general sense, brings national attention to them. But I mean, the success of the basketball program ends up helping the hockey program too, which had been successful but was playing in their own relatively small rink as well. I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of the Conte Forum. I've been there I went to grad school at BC. I've been there many times. I think in many ways it's the quintessential multi-sports venue that's not a great fit for either of them, but it gave them a big-time 10,000 seat arena, and I think to compete. I mean, it was a requirement for the Big East that you either needed a big on-campus arena of more than 8,000, or you played at a venue like the Boston Garden. I mean, the Big East really forces BC into playing more games at the Garden, which Gary Williams did not like because they had so little time on that court. I mean, the Celtics struggled to get time at the Boston Garden because Jacobs, who owns the Bruins, was very, very hesitant with giving out the The Celtics are practicing at Hellenic College. BC is certainly not going to be as high on the food chain as the Celtics, so they got on there like an hour before the game, maybe got to have a walk through the day before the game for an hour. So to them, even though it was close by, it didn't feel like the home court advantage it might have otherwise. Moreover, when they're playing Georgetown, like half the fans were Georgetown fans, particularly when Patrick Ewing is there. You'd gone to Cambridge, Ringe, and Latin. Half of Cambridge came up to see the game. St. John's traveled well. Villanova traveled well. So when they played those games at the Garden, it was oftentimes kind of 50-50. I mean, in part because BC's a little bit smaller school than most of those other institutions, too. So they have a little bit smaller alumni base.
You mentioned the Flutie effect. If I could just digress, Doug Flutie in that senior season for football was absolutely tremendous. I still think that play against the Miami Hurricanes is the best ending play of all time in college football. I don't care whatever comes after that. That play was just unbelievable. And Doug Flutie was definitely, at that time, he was must-see TV, and he was on the top of the new sportscast as well, and the newscast, because he was just playing great football. But it was Flutie pandemonium in that season, his senior year when he won the Heisman.
Absolutely. And I think in terms of it being the greatest play of all time, whether something more spectacular comes up, the Flutie play remains the measuring stick for all the other great plays. When people talk about, well, this is the greatest play ever, that's always what what it's in reference to, what they're talking about. Whether it's the Cordell Stewart Hail Mary against Michigan, or the kick six with the Auburn, Alabama, or Stanford and the band or whatever. It's by comparison to the Flutie play, which I think was viewed almost immediately as the greatest play that had ever happened in college football.
Unbelievable. And you watched the replays, just getting off topic here. Phelan ran all the way down the end zone untouched, which is mind-boggling. I've watched it to see if anybody touched him. He did not get touched by a Miami defender his whole sprint down to the end zone. Tremendous, tremendous play.
I'm just always amazed how Flutie could let it rip, too. I mean, it seemed like he didn't have a lot of trouble getting the ball that far. I mean, such a little guy, of course. I've only ever seen him up close once. There's a pizza place called Pitino's in Cleveland Circle one time, and I was just having a slice of pizza, and he walked in very inconspicuously, just kind of had his hat pulled down, was taking out about 5 pizzas and a couple of pasta dishes, and he was gone before I realized who it was. And I went up to the guy at the counter, was like, oh, yeah, he comes in here a few times a year. So.
One other thing about that play, the referees had blown the whistle before that Flutie pass, and there was no penalty, and it maybe gave the BC Eagles the time to breathe a little bit because the crowd was quiet, and I think they had a chance to catch their breath. And then technically on the football stats, it was 47-yard pass, and he threw it like 73 yards. I couldn't believe it. That was just, unbelievable.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the look of the field in that game too, just how torn up it is. I think that's part of the story. It's so cinematic looking back at it.
Yeah, so all right, we got off on a tangent there, but I had to talk about Flutie. I still think it's great. So, one thing about some of the players that you talked about on the teams, I had the chance to play in an all-star game my senior year in 1984, and I was on the East team, and on the West team, it was John Williams from Northeastern and Jeff Timberlake from BC High, and who went to BU. And I'll tell you what, John Williams, he played on Don Bosco's team. They had 2 other guys on that team. Chenault Terry was like 6'8", and Steve Malloy was 6'7", and they were like a nationally ranked top 5 team, if not the number 1 team in the country at that time. And Lowell High beat them their senior year in the tournament. And that Lowell team had Ramon Rivera, who played at Houston, and then Scott Stapleton, who played at Richmond, University of Richmond. So little tidbit there, but those guys were the guys from Don Bosco were unbelievable. And Mark Plansky was on that West team as well, with the likes of John Williams, Terry, and Steve Malloy. So
I think just looking back, one of the things, simply just doing the research for this and looking at the old all-scholastic teams and stuff in the Boston Globe, it's amazing how much talent came out of Massachusetts and southern New England more broadly during that era. I would say more so than now. I don't know why that is. Players went all over the country to big-time programs there. Maybe the area's been – I don't really understand what's going on, but there were just so many significant college players coming out of the particularly eastern Massachusetts during that time period.
Yeah, and there were some other – Dana Barros was a sophomore or freshman that year. He was all-scholastic in the Boston Globe, and he was at the Celtics game the other night. So Game 5. So, but yeah, it's just amazing when you look back at, you see the names. It's pretty awesome. And then also BU had some pretty good games as well. They played Michigan in November 27th, 1989, and Mike Jarvis was the coach of BU at the time. And, of course, Ramil Robinson, who he coached at Cambridge Ridge and Latin, it was kind of like a homecoming. But Mike Jarvis, he was part of that coaching fraternity after those guys had moved on. All three had moved on.
Yeah, I mean, Jarvis is a guy who grows up in Cambridge, went to Ridge Tech, the predecessor to Cambridge Ridge and Latin, is a backup for his career at Northeastern as a player. But Dick Dukeshire, his coach, with whom he bonded very closely, said that prepared him to be a coach because, in a way, he had the mentality of a coach that he was getting guys prepared to play his entire college career. I mean, a guy who barely saw the floor got asked immediately by Dukeshire to be an assistant. I mean, is a pretty remarkable thing. He immediately is a Northeastern assistant for several years. For the first year with Calhoun, he's an assistant. He leaves to take a job with Satch Sanders, the Celtics grade, who had just become the Harvard coach in '73. I mean, in part, Satch Sanders is one of the first African-American Division I basketball coaches, and Mike Jarvis wanted to do what he could to contribute to his success. After a few years there, he goes to Cambridge Ridge and Latin, which had merged in 1977, the two historically great Cambridge high schools, and Jarvis makes them a national power. I mean, they lose, I think, 1 or 2 games, I forget what it is, in their entire tenure. And you have Ewing and Ramil Robinson and a lot of other fantastic players come out of that. Carl Hobbs come out of that program, and they win multiple championships and are regarded as the national champion on a couple of occasions.
What are the
and of course, Jarvis, go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, and Jarvis goes on, and BU is very quickly looking. Pitino coaches through the '83 season. They have a replacement, John Kuester, who comes in. Kuester, by all accounts, is an excellent X's and O's guy. He goes on and coaches in the NBA. He's the coach of the Pistons in the early 2000s, replacing Larry Brown, I believe it was. But he just wasn't ready to be a head coach. He was like 25, 26 years old. And what a couple of the guys said about him was he came from UNC. He was used to everybody who played around him being like a 5-star blue blood kind of player. And he had trouble dealing with guys who had clear flaws in their game. And he just didn't. He had some trouble as an in-game manager. And BU went from being in the NCAA tournament in '83 with a fairly young team to a team that's kind of like a 500-ish team the next 2 years. He ends up leaving to go to George Washington. And BU has to scramble for a coach. Best coach in the area who's available is Mike Jarvis. Mike Jarvis didn't even have to move. He lived in the same house in Cambridge. He bought a house with his wife in Cambridge in 1966 or something, and he lived there until he took the George Washington job in the early 90s, which he takes over from John Kuester, who didn't do very well there. They had like a 1-23 season or something like that, and Jarvis ends up getting that job. So he just 2 times in a row follows John Kuester into a head coaching gig. He turns BU into, once Calhoun leaves, turns them into the power of the ECAC North, which evolves into the North Atlantic Conference and is now America East. They go to the tournament on several occasions. And Jarvis keeps moving on up to coaching at George Washington, getting them to the Sweet 16, and later on getting St. John's there. So, I mean, he had a remarkable coaching career. I think taken together, he belongs in the Basketball Hall of Fame. I think he has a collection of remarkable contributions to basketball. Most significantly, being a coach who is a clear advocate for his players, which he was with Patrick Ewing. That this is before there's any of the recruiting rules in place. The whole country wanted a piece of Patrick Ewing in the late 70s. His family couldn't sleep. Their phone was ringing off the hook all day and night. Jarvis comes in, says, I'm going to manage his recruitment. Here are 5 rules that you have to follow if you want us to even consider you. And it helped the Ewing family have a semblance of a normal life in spite of their son being recruited by everybody in the country. He found a great location in Georgetown and went on and had, of course, one of the most remarkable college careers ever. I think he offered a role model, a guide for how coaches could look out for their players in this very oftentimes unpleasant process that is college recruiting.
Yeah. In 1989, I was given I was referred by a old college professor to Jack Renault, who was the SID at Northeastern at the time, and I was a PA announcer at Northeastern for 5 years, from '89 to '94. So I saw the Northeastern BU years later in that time frame between Carl Fogel and Mike Jarvis. And boy, those games were intense at the Matthews Arena. I really enjoyed. That was a lot of fun watching those games. But Mike Jarvis just had this polished look about him, and when he was he just had a composure about him that was just very impressive.
Well, one thing a couple of guys told me about him, that he did a very good job with the officials, because he wasn't the typical yapping at the officials the whole game kind of coach. If his guy got a foul, he would tend to go up to them and say, well, if you got yourself in a better position, you wouldn't have got a foul. Don't do that again. And the officials would hear this, and they'd be like, this is a reasonable guy. So in the long run, that strategy is very helpful with him at calls, because as opposed to just getting chewed out for the whole game, he talked with his own players as opposed to hounding the officials.
He'd come to the scores table and he'd say hi to everybody at the scores table. Very, very nice. Carl Fogel was a nice guy too. He was intense, but another great coach for Northeastern. But those Northeastern games at the old Matthews Arena were absolutely fun to watch, and that's a great memory that I have from those days. So it was a lot of fun. I
couldn't be sadder about the demise of Matthews. I mean, I hope to get down there one or two times this year to get back in the building. It's one of my favorite, both as a hockey venue and a basketball venue. Just love the building. It's just got so much personality and character, and there's no way to replace it.
Yeah, it's a great building. I saw some Northeastern games. I was able to get tickets, and it was just awesome. It has its own it's like a little mini Boston Garden back in the day. It was really fun. So while we're on Northeastern, we have to talk about Reggie Lewis. Reggie Lewis, obviously, probably the greatest player to come out of Northeastern, but he was quite the player in college, and he got to be an all-star in the NBA.
Yeah, I mean, I talked to people. One thing I asked people who played with him or coached him was, how soon did you know he was going to be such a special player? Mm-hmm. And they said the first time they practiced at Northeastern, they understood it. They didn't realize how quick he was, how effective a shooter he was. He was the best player on the floor. Even this is a team with Mark Halsell and a lot of other big-time players. He walked on the floor, and he was the best player there in his first practice, and he maintained that the rest of his career. Every team they ever played beat up on him, did everything they could to knock him down, just kept his composure, and was consistently excellent throughout his college career. I mean, he's the conference player of the year 3 times in a row at Northeastern. What I think is probably a top 5 player in the history of New England college basketball, mm-hmm. if I had to. I mean, certainly not number 1, but I think you could argue he's in the top 5 and as good as anybody in his era. And, of course, the tragedy that takes place a few years ago with the Celtics is an unspeakably horrible thing. But he has such a unique legacy in the city of Boston, both from being the captain of the Celtics and also being for 4 years just such a remarkable presence at Northeastern. And somebody that kept people coming into the buildings. Northeastern ended up drawing better eventually. I mean, after struggling attendance-wise for a number of years, especially after they moved into Matthews, when Northeastern buys the old Boston Arena from the city in '79. It's very briefly called Northeastern Arena, I think, for 2 seasons before taking on the Matthews. And Lewis was the signature attraction there, and very sad we didn't get to see more of his career, but it's a joy we got to see what we did.
Yeah. Play against Lenny Bias, if I'm not mistaken. He did play against Lenny Bias at College Park. And was Reggie Lewis, was it said that he was the best player on the court that night?
That's the writer for the Washington Post who covered the game, whose name escapes me at the moment, said Len Bias is a great player, but Reggie Lewis was the best player in this game that night. And this was at Maryland, in front of just a wild crowd there. He's like, he was and it was such a homecoming game for him, being a kid from Baltimore, went to Dunbar High. I mean, pretty close down the road for him, and had a at the game. And they got beat in the game, but Reggie was the star that night.
That's incredible that when you look back, maybe he could have gone to Maryland, but obviously that didn't happen. But it's just amazing. He was the best player that night. It's one quote that stuck out to me from the book. So just about UConn, they just rattled off their second NCAA tournament, and that's the foundation by Jim Calhoun. Danny Hurley is doing a bang-up job at UConn.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly continuing the process. I think in spirit, he's not dissimilar to Calhoun, too. It strikes me as personality-wise exactly the kind of guy Calhoun would want representing the school and continuing what he has going on here. I love that he turned the Lakers down. I think that's fantastic. I hope, good luck to them as they pursue. I mean, they're not my team, but good luck to them as they pursue more championships. I mean, it's just so consistently excellent what they've had the last couple of seasons. Just such dominant teams. You don't see in recent years. There haven't been tournament teams like that. I wouldn't say that are as able to consistently dominate the opposition as his teams have the past 2 seasons. So it's been a real pleasure to see.
He's got quite the demeanor. I love his demeanor in the interviews. He just plays it cool, straight, even keel interviews, and the players love him. Before the tournament, I remember they were talking about the brackets, and they said the UConn bracket was the hardest one, and they blew out everybody.
He just had that team incredibly well prepared to play every night. I think sometimes the teams that blow a bunch of teams out end up having a letdown once they face somebody who can really hang in there with them, kind of the UNLV against Duke, the second time effect. But UConn didn't really have that in their tournament run this year, to my recollection. They were able to just go out there and do their business every single time. I
think when they played Alabama in the national semifinal, Alabama pushed them a little bit, but they didn't break. They bent, but they didn't break. That's that. I thought Alabama. And we got to talk about the Celtics. The Celtics rattled off their 18th NBA championships. What are your thoughts on the Celtics? I thought it was great, and they seem to get disrespected in some respect, but they pulled it off, and I was very, very proud of them for winning. They really endured a lot of criticism this year.
They certainly did, and it's nice to see all these guys who were told they could never win a championship, and they were a good regular season team, but they couldn't win when it counts. It was nice to see these guys, both in management and on the team, able to finally do that. I think in particular, the thing that was most annoying to me was just the continuous discussion of, they have such an easy path to get there. Well, they certainly had significant injuries as well, as teams do anytime. I mean, there's so many contingent things anytime you make a run that just, I felt that narrative was out there in a way, kind of by a lot of people, simply to cheapen what the Celtics accomplished. And they really had an incredibly dominant run to the title, and hopefully there can be multiple runs there. But at the same time, I'm very much enjoy the championship you have. You have no idea if it's going to come back again. It's been a real pleasure to watch the games. I mean, I tend to go to bed early, so 8:30 has been a bit of a struggle for me for the games. I have to stay up till the 11 o'clock news or whatever. But we made it, and it was spring.
Yeah, I'm on Central Time here. My bedtime's like at 8:15, but I made the exception. The second championship in 38 years, I stayed up till midnight. I had to watch it. It happens once, so I had to do that. And then they honored Bill Walton very nice, I thought, prior to the NBA championship. I got a story about Bill Walton, but that was quite the homage they paid to him by wearing those, the warm-ups. I thought that was totally awesome. I think that's what makes the Celtics so special.
I'm glad they did it. I mean, clearly the Celtics had such a special place in the heart of Bill Walton, probably second to UCLA, and it was nice to see that the Celtics recognized that mutual love between him and also the organization.
And, real quick about when he was there, I think he really enjoyed playing with the likes. He didn't care if he was coming off the bench, subbing for Bird, McHale, or Parrish. And I think he really enjoyed that experience, just, not being the guy. And I think I looked at his, after he passed away, I looked at his stats, and the only season he played 80 games was that 85-86 season. That's unbelievable. He was rejuvenated.
That's unbelievable. Have you ever read that book by David Halberstam, Breaks to the Game?
I have, but I'll have to read it again. But, yeah, I'll have to.
You just see, he as a young man, he's like 25 there. He is so physically compromised then. He was like patched together to play, very early in his career. I mean, he ends up missing the playoffs when they're going for their second championship run with the Blazers. I mean, the book focuses on the year after the championship, and he couldn't be more banged up as such a young player. And it's remarkable he was able to play as long as he did and have that kind of second act to his career with the Celtics. I think it's the best basketball book ever written, and certainly one of the best sports books I've ever read in any sport. I mean, in terms of hockey, there's Ken Dryden's The Game I would put alongside that. Mm-hmm. But to me, those are probably my sports books overall.
Yeah, I love seeing those pictures with Walton, Bird, McHale, and Parrish in the Celtic white uniforms. I thought that was totally awesome. I do have a story about real quick here before we sign off here. I was working at a radio station in my college days. It was the 85-86 season. I worked for WCCM in Lawrence. It was a Kurt Gowdy station, and I used to do sports in between my college, Christmas. And they sent me down to go watch the Celtics play the Nuggets, and that was the year they won 39 games and lost one at home. So after the game, I'm in the Celtics locker room, first time ever. I'm like, it's an out-of-body experience for me because I'm seeing Mikhail, Parrish, all these people in the locker room. And Bill Walton's sitting over there in the corner of his locker. And I went up to him and I said, Bill, can I ask you a few questions? This is the first time I've ever done this. He goes, yeah, no problem. And it was like, I don't remember what I asked him, but the fact that he was so kind to me and answered the questions, I shook his head and I said, thank you very much. I think I have the tape somewhere, but he could not have been nicer. So when he passed away, I felt, he gave me 10 minutes of his life, and I thought that was extraordinary.
That is extraordinary. I mean, that really tells somebody who has no reason to per se do something like that and just is kind to people like that. That certainly stands out. What a remarkable experience. Thanks for sharing that. I love that story.
Yeah, it was, I thought about it and I was like, gosh, but it's remarkable for his career that he was, his NBA career, the Celtics, he played the only season 80 games. So I've had Clayton Trutor on my podcast. He's the author of Bostonball, Rick Pitino, Jim Calhoun, Gary Williams, and the Forgotten Cradle of Basketball Coaches. I read this book, and it's still in pristine condition because I didn't want to mess with the cover. This is a great book, and I may read it again, but Clayton, I can't thank you enough for coming on my podcast. I'm really honored that you would do that.
Oh, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure. Please ask me anytime. Love to talk basketball. We can talk about whatever's going on at the time. It would be a real pleasure. This has been a lot of fun once again.